Hello again and welcome back. Generally, I try and stay on the topic of fitness when it comes to the videos here, but the video I put out last week called Why We Train received so much positive feedback that it's very clear everybody's interested in different ideas on the topic of self-reliance and preparedness, not just in regards to fitness. So I thought it'd be worth our while to broaden our discussion on the topic a little bit and go beyond just the fitness. Now, this is not going to become a political channel or anything like that, but I think once, maybe every other week, maybe once a month, I will do what is probably just going to be a series of videos where we will talk very generally about what I am titling localism. I looked up the term localism in 2 or 3 different places and got slightly different definitions, some having more to do with language, others having more to do with local politics. I'm just going to use it as kind of a general catch-all term because I think it relatively accurately describes what I want to talk about. If somebody has a better definition for localism, then you can let me know down in the comments below. But the point is, don't get too fixated on the term localism. Like I said, I'm just kind of using that because it's a convenient term that seems to summarize what I want to talk about. I was initially going to set the stage for this conversation by kind of talking about some of the events I felt like had led to us being where we're at now. But it almost seems a little bit pointless because, one, it was only a couple of years ago that all these things happened that I would be talking about anyway. All you were there. You guys all remember what happened, and it's still happening. And the second reason is that when we get into those cultural and political events that led us to the state we're in now, that's really just a manifestation of problems that are much deeper than that and go back much earlier than those events. So in the interest of not making a video where we have to start the conversation at 1776 and then work our way to the present and just not preaching to the choir in general, we'll just establish a few presuppositions that will get everybody up to speed and that I think most of you will agree with me on anyway. And if you don't agree with me on these presuppositions, I would be curious to know why. So please let me know in the comments below. And keep in mind, if you haven't guessed already, I am from the United States. We will be talking about the United States mostly, but I think the ideas and lessons that we're going to be talking about apply to the Western world in general. So it doesn't really matter if you're from here or not. The first presupposition is going to be that we are going through multiple existential crises at once. And to give you a better idea of what I'm thinking of when I say existential crisis, when we think back to events like 9/11 or the 2008 housing crisis bubble or the Afghanistan war and the disastrous withdrawal from that, those things were terrible. They hurt a lot of people in a lot of different ways, so I don't want to diminish those events at all. But generally speaking, the average American's ability to go to the store and pick from 20 different sugary cereals was still maintained. And as terrible and awful as those events were, the average American was able to go and put gas in their car and drive to work the next day. The existential crises and problems that I'm referring to are things that are going to personally affect you in a negative way. They're going to negatively affect your standard of living, your rights and freedoms and privileges as an American, if not just destroy those things altogether. And so when I say existential crisis, I kind of want you guys to keep those things in mind because we live in a relatively resilient, dynamic society, but I'm talking about system-crippling events. And presupposition number 1 that we'll be working with is not just that we're headed towards one of these system-crippling events, but that we're facing multiple existential problems at the same time. And unless there is some sort of dramatic course change in the near future, we will have to deal with and suffer through the end consequences of these problems. And when we consider that these things aren't happening in a vacuum, they're happening simultaneously, and they very often play into each other, making one another worse, it becomes very easy to imagine that whatever the end conclusion of these existential crises are, is going to be something that we cannot realistically recover from as a country. And that whoever or whatever survives that will be very different from what we are accustomed to now. So the first presupposition is that we are going through multiple existential crises at once, and we do not seem to be anywhere close to course correcting in any meaningful way in regards to any of these problems. The second presupposition is going to be that our institutions have lost or are losing in a very critical way their ability to fulfill whatever their function is. And in many cases, it's not just that, it's that they've turned completely and totally predatory and are now attacking and subverting whatever their original purpose was supposed to be. Now, this second presupposition is more conditional because it's going to change based upon which institution we're referring to, what time, what place, and under what circumstance. But generally speaking, the idea is that institutions are no longer things that we can rely on, and in many cases are things that we have to actively guard against now, or at some point in the future we'll have to guard against. And I want you to keep in mind that when I'm talking about institutions, I'm not just referring to the obvious example of the federal government and its agencies and different branches. I'm talking about local and state government. I'm talking about the private sector and big corporations, colleges, universities, journalism, the mainstream media, churches, all those things. And that is the second presupposition, that a large portion, if not a majority of our institutions are somewhere between dying, dead, and having been completely turned against us. And that as time goes on, we will be able to rely on them less and less for all their essential functions, and there will come a time where we will not be able to count on them at all, unless we want to subject ourselves to them in ways that the majority of us would find unacceptable. Now, the third and final presupposition is much more on the ground floor, and it applies much more to you personally. It's also a little bit harder to define into one neat category because there's a lot of different moving parts to it. But essentially, the general idea is that governments and civilizations ultimately are downstream from the people. And we see that reflected in different ideas that we're brought up with in the West. Ideas about individual rights, consent of the governed, government for the people, by the people. All of these things bring us back to the people and the individual. And so if we have a corrupt populace where a majority of the people are morally and intellectually bankrupt, then there is no political solution that would remedy that. There is only cultural and spiritual solutions to that. Because ultimately the driver of culture and the basic unit of governments and systems are the family and individuals. And to give you an example of what I'm trying to verbalize, if you imagine yourself trying to build a house and you're pulling from a pile of lumber that's infested with termites, it doesn't matter how perfect the structural plan for the house is or how great the architectural design is. It's always going to fall apart because your most basic building block that you're using to put the structure together is rotten at the very center. And you can bring in different carpenters and different architects with different design plans. It doesn't matter, you're still pulling from that same rotten pile of wood. And so you either need to find a new pile of wood, or in this case with people, we need to remedy the infestation and somehow get rid of this moral and intellectual rot and decay. And so it doesn't matter what type of political system you want to talk about. It doesn't matter what type of legislation you want to pass in the long run if the fundamental driving force and building block of those systems and policies is corrupt. It's always going to end up doing something bad. It's always going to fall apart in the end. The same way that that house is always going to fall apart if you keep pulling from that pile of wood with the termite infestation. And something that I want you guys to really try and keep in mind as we go throughout this series and talk about this third presupposition and other things that are related to it is that when we're discussing immorality, degeneracy, corruption, ignorance, we're very often, the majority of the time, thinking of somebody else. And when we talk about this third presupposition and the corruption of the people, I want you to think about yourself first and others second every single time. And in later videos, we will get into why I think this third presupposition is so important and why you have to apply this third presupposition to yourself first and others last. But to summarize, the third presupposition is essentially corrupt people lead to corrupt societies. And that is something that we will expound upon more as the series goes on. And so now that we have our three presuppositions laid out, we are all hopefully on the same page. And what we will be talking about throughout the remainder of this series is localism, what it is, what it may look like, and why I think it may be one of our few hopes when we're looking at how to deal with these problems that we've talked about. And while I don't want to advertise the ideas we're going to be talking about in this series as a foolproof philosophy that's going to solve all your problems, when I try and understand the big picture perspective of these existential crises that we've talked about, and we see them unfolding right in front of us in our lifetime, and we can look into history and see that these same problems have affected societies and groups of people in the past, and we can see what they lead to when they're not addressed. And I start listening to different people and reading different things, trying to find out what a solution to these things might be. I seem to hear the same political solutions that have been presented in the past many times before. And these solutions don't seem to help the problems, and in many cases they just add to the severity of them. And when I try and take this big picture perspective and try and figure out what to do with it, I always seem to come back to localism. When I look at these issues from the ground up, from a personal perspective, and I wonder how I and people in my immediate social circle can navigate these problems, I still end up at the same place, which is localism. And so it seems to me that no matter what lens I try and view this problem through, the solution is always the same, at least from what I can see. And so I realized that I have not actually gotten into what localism is at all. And so in the next video, we're going to be doing the initial breakdown of what my idea of localism is, why I think it's probably one of our only realistic solutions to all the problems we've been talking about. We'll talk about what localism could potentially look like in the short term, in the long term, and how you can potentially start to implement it into your own situation. And we'll also talk about two historical examples that I want to draw social and political characteristics from, and that I think we should try and apply when we're trying to bring about this idea of localism into our own communities. So please stay tuned for the next video in the series where we will talk about what localism actually is. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will talk to you later.